Suppose we have the following graph and we want to find a formula which tells us how much edges a graph has based on only knowing the amount of degrees each vertex of the graph has. So what we can do is we can take the sum of all the degrees of the vertices of this graph, which we would note like this. And taking the sum of all the degrees will give us twice the amount of edges. This is noted as the amount of edges of the graph. And why is it twice the amount of the edges of the graph? Well, if we take the sum of the degrees of the vertices, suppose we start with C, this has a degree of 3, and then we look at B, which also has a degree of 3, we notice that we have counted this edge twice. And since an edge can only be connected to two vertices at once, by taking the sum of all the degrees, we count each edge twice. So the sum of the degrees will give you twice the amount of edges. So how can we find the formula that tells us the amount of edges based on the degrees? Well, we simply solve it for the amount of edges, which will give us the amount of edges is a half times the sum of degrees. Now let's apply this formula to this graph. We start with a half and we multiply the sum of degrees. Well, the sum of degrees will be the degree of vertex A, which is 3, it's connected to 3 vertices, plus the degree of B, which is also 3, plus the degree of C is also 3, degree of D is 3, and the degree of E is 4. So this will be 4, 7, 10, 13, 16 divided by 2 is 8. So this formula tells us that this graph should have 8 edges. So let's count to see if it's correct. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. It's correct. And this formula is called the handshaking lemma. But suppose we have a more complex situation. Suppose we have a new graph, and this graph has, let's say, 100 vertices. This is the notation for the amount of vertices a graph has. And let's say that each vertex of this graph has a degree of 3. So a question could be, how much edges does this graph has? Well, we simply plug these values into this formula, which will give us a half times the sum of degrees. Well, what is the sum of degrees? We have 100 vertices, and each vertex has a degree of 3. So the sum will be 100 times 3, which is 300 divided by 2 is 150. So this formula will tell us that this graph should have 150 edges.